Hello, everyone, and welcome to an ALEC TV live stream. I'm Catherine Mortensen from Public Affairs. Joining me here in the studio is Carla Jones. She is our policy expert on all things related to federal lands. And then joining us remotely, we're so excited to have Commissioner Will Cavan from Chavez County, New Mexico, and State Representative Ken Ivory from Utah. They're joining us today from Lincoln, Nebraska. They're there for a summit dealing with the very topic we're talking about today, which is this encroachment of the federal government into private lands. We'll get into that. The particular event they're at is the so-called 30 by 30 summit. So we'll be talking about that. And if you're not familiar with ALEC, really briefly, I just want to tell you that ALEC is the nation's largest nonpartisan voluntary organization of state lawmakers. We have great men and women like Ken Ivory from the state level. We also have local members, people such as Will Cavan, who represent the county and city level government. And what we do here at ALEC is work to share model policy and just sort of best practices on legislation that promotes federalism, limited government, and free markets. So today, I think the really issue is federalism. And Carla, why don't you just start us off with just sort of what we want to get into and questions for our two guests.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Kat. And thank you, Commissioner Cavan. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually. Because you're a local official, I figured you probably had the best on-the-ground view of the administration's land grab, for lack of a better word. I know New Mexico is 32% federally owned. Can you give us an idea of what's happening in rural communities in your state, in your county? Because one of the things about us Easterners is we are hopelessly ignorant when it comes to the challenges of the states in the West.
Well, I appreciate the question, and you know, back 6 years ago, as the Obama administration was coming to a close, you know, we were dealing with the Bureau of Land Management on a resource management plan, which was going to involve Lee County, Eddy County, and Chavez County. And so, just one of the things that's happening at a local level is these entities from the Department of Interior are working on creating like wilderness areas and habitats for endangered species, and in the process of that, they're taking up a lot of land and putting us in a bad position. And you come 6 years later, 5 years later, now we have a new administration from the 4 years that we had with President Trump, and they're, you know, I hear the folks in the Fish and Wildlife and Bureau of Land Management, they start talking about picking back up where they were in 2015, and that's pretty scary. So we're doing all right with the BLM at the moment, but now the Forest Service, which is under the USDA, now they've come out with a plan that's going to be on the other side of Chavez County with a forest plan where they're looking at in that forest plan and creating another 400,000 acres of wilderness area in the Lincoln National Forest. And when we create those types of areas, well, anybody who might be seeing the news from out west with all the fires that we're having and everything, but we just had a huge fire up in Lincoln County, about 60 miles from us in Roswell, that burnt 60,000 plus acres and loss of 2 lives, 207 homes that were lost in that fire. And you can see that picture that just came up, and it was fast, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that because of endangered species stuff and the spotted owl was listed, we don't have the opportunity to harvest the trees or clean up the fuels that are on the ground. Our ranchers and farmers and dairy guys, they're all being harmed by these things that are coming from the federal government, from the East Coast as it would be. And it just is really important that we get folks educated on what's going on out west.
Yeah. Wildfires are possibly one of the most tragic consequences of federal mismanagement of the federal estate. Representative Ivory, I'm guessing, in fact, I'm not guessing, I know you have some stories to share with us, given the fact that Utah is more than 60% federally owned and that you've been a leader in the transfer of public land space for years. In fact, you're the one who first told me that it was an issue. So could you share some of those stories with us?
Yeah, thank you, Carla and Commissioner. It's great to be on with you. I'm sure sorry about the fire issue you have. We're experiencing that all throughout the West. It's a tremendous issue that rather than have our forests managed like a garden, the way we used to manage them locally, and we would treat the resource and the management of the forest in a sustainable way. It's now managed like a museum. It's hands off, don't touch, and the trees grow beyond the capacity of the water to carry them. It's quite arid in the West in many places, and so we get trees that get to 500 and 1,000 trees per acre, and it's like having 100 straws in your Diet Coke. They're all fighting to get little bits of drops of water, and then they're not healthy. They can't fend off the diseases, and we have dead stands of trees all over the West. I mean, millions of acres, and so that's where we're seeing these catastrophic wildfires, and sadly, we're in a condition now where the federal government seems to be managing these forests for maximum combustion instead of for the environmental health and well-being of the forests, of the economy, of the communities. It's a tremendous issue. I mean, story on that, Carla. In Montana a couple of years ago, their helicopters, the state helicopters, they have a lot of land that is state land, and they've equipped their helicopters to be faster and carry more water than the typical helicopters that are fighting fires nationally. And when a fire broke out in Montana a few years back, the Forest Service grounded the state of Montana's helicopters because they weren't on the approved list. And so these helicopters that were faster and carried more water were grounded because they weren't approved by the Forest Service, and they had to sit and just simply watch the forest burn and watch the pollutants stream into the atmosphere. We had some scientists from Georgia Tech University come and report to a committee hearing a couple of years ago that the pollutants from the wildfires, it's like lighting an oil refinery on fire. The pollutants are just tragic. And so we're seeing a lot of impacts there. We've got loss of life, the animal life that's lost. They estimate about 10 to 20 animals per acre is burned alive in these massive wildfires. And we're seeing about 10 million acres, 8 to 10 million acres a year going up in flames. And so the loss of wildlife that are being burned, incinerated in the name of protecting wildlife is tragic. The loss of the forest in the name of protecting the forest is tragic. And then at the same time, we're losing economies, we're losing local care and management, we're losing communities. And then to top it all off, after the fire goes through, we get to live with the runoff for decades after, because all of the ground cover is burned off and there's nothing to hold the runoff. So when the rains do come, all of the silt and sediment and rocks the size of Volkswagens come rolling down out of the mountains, and it just takes all of the topsoil and runoff. So really tremendous issue. In Utah, we had a study about 4 years ago that the water supply to 40% of the Wasatch Front, which is 2 million people in Utah, the water supply is one spark away from being gone because of this kind of federal mismanagement. So these are tremendously serious issues. So when people wonder why we get a little bit excited about this in the West, it's because it really literally is a matter of life and death.
And I would just like to say to anyone who's watching, if you'd like to comment or ask a question, you're welcome to do so on whichever platform, if you're on YouTube, Facebook, or Rumble, and we can answer your questions or address them in real time. And what I want to share right now is a screen of the lands here. Hold on. So this map is from 2010, but Carla assures me that it really hasn't changed so much in the past decade. You can see here that on the 12 states west of Colorado, they are the darkest, which the darker blue, the more, the federal government owns of that state. The state with the most federally owned land, you can see there is Nevada. On average, all of those 12 states west of Colorado, the federal government owns about 47% of the lands in each of those states. And I really want to hear a little bit, if Carla could just express to us what is the problem with the federal government owning such a large portion of our western states?
Well, first of all, both Commissioner Cavan and Representative Ivory went into some of the problems. And next week, we're going to be going into it in even more detail with Representative Ivory and his colleague, Representative Stratton, in the Utah House. But suffice it to say, it's impossible for a state to maximize its economic opportunities when, in many cases, more than half of its land is federally controlled. They can't diversify economically. They don't have the tax base to fund things like education, infrastructure, law enforcement, and other social services. And what the federal government tries to do is make up that difference with what they call PILT, payments in lieu of taxes. My members call it pittance in lieu of taxes, and we'll be going into that in greater detail as well. It doesn't nearly come close to making up for the taxes that the states would be able to get if they controlled the lands within their borders. And it would be one thing if the federal government were doing a bang-up job of managing the federal lands. But as we heard, they're not. Wildfires we keep hitting record wildfire season after record wildfire season after record wildfire season. And even groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists have conceded that while climate change is partly responsible, federal mismanagement of the federal estate is also responsible.
Carla, if I could just make one point here, federal regulatory redundancy creates inefficiencies. And one example is in Oklahoma, it takes 700 times longer to get a drilling permit on federal lands as opposed to private lands. Mm-hmm. Commissioner, would you want to respond to that, the sort of inefficiencies that we see from the federal government in their management?
Well, and really, it's a great question. And part of the problem is that you go from one administration to another where, just 2 years ago, we were energy independent in this country. And that's because we had an administration and our Department of Interior run by Secretary Bernhardt and folks like Tim Williams and others that were working in the Interior. And so you change administrations all of a sudden, and then all of a sudden you shut down leases and you shut off the Keystone Pipeline and you shut off all these deals. But I mean, for New Mexico, we have Eddy and Lee County and a small portion of Chavez County that are all part of the Permian Basin, which is one of the largest oil fields, I would tell you, probably in the world, maybe, but definitely here in the United States. And so when you start messing with the leases and I'm hearing stories about, well, you can't use this lease on here because it's in Squaw Valley or Squaw Creek or something along those lines. And they just pick and choose how they pick. Now, because of Ukraine, supposedly, now they're opening up the lease process and trying to get, but it's ridiculous that they manage things the way they do, and the environmentalist and the climate change stuff is just off the charts.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Let me just get the screen back. Carla and Representative Ivory, you all have worked closely together on this issue of devolution. Is that the word? Of transferring lands back to the states. Is that sort of the policy solution to address these concerns?
That is definitely one of the policy solutions to address the concerns. And I think one of the things that's important to say is what devolution or transfer of public lands is not. We're not talking about national parks. We're not talking about congressionally designated wilderness areas. We're not talking about tribal lands. We're not talking about military installations. We're talking about the vast expanses of land in the West that is uninhabited and that could be used by the states to create a tax base. In terms of to try to underscore how outsized federal ownership is of federal lands, Washington, D.C. is the seat of federal power. Less than 25% of Washington, D.C. is owned by the federal government, whereas more than 80% of Nevada is owned by the federal government.
Commissioner Ivory, how do you think this transfer of public lands would play out in a state like Utah? What would that look like, and how would it benefit the people of Utah?
Well, in Utah, we already have a public land, the Utah Public Land Management Act, and because you have to understand, because this has been going on for more than 100 years. Our statehood was in 1896, and the promise at that time was the same promise, in fact, the exact same promise as the state that I'm in right now. I'm in Nebraska for this Stop 30 by 30 Summit. We have the exact same terms of statehood, the exact same promises of statehood, that the federal government would divest any of the land that it acquired and that it held in trust for the creation of the states. There are Supreme Court cases to the effect that they only held the land as trustees for the state ultimately to be created. So we came into the Union on that same basis, that we would be treated equally and have the ability to control the land within our borders. And to give you an example right now, we can't even run emergency communication lines. We can't run pipelines or roads because they go through federal land, and we have to have federal approval. The commissioner mentioned the Permian Basin. You've got a boundary line on the Permian Basin, and on the Texas side of the Permian Basin, they have state permitting, and they're able to drill and access the land and produce energy and oil and keep the price down. And on the New Mexico side, it's all through federal permits. And so the way things would work in the state, we've already spelled out in great detail. Because this has been going on for more than 100 years, we now have grazing issues and water rights issues, which is a matter of state law. We've got recreation and hunting and fishing and all sorts of rights that have accrued over the period of more than a century now. And so at the state level, we would manage and maintain all of those various rights, so we keep those together. It's not something where you can just simply sell off all of the land or much of the land. There are so many rights that have accrued over time that working with the counties and working through the state, we need to recognize those various rights and interests, but do it in a way that reflects the needs of the local community, that reflects the understanding of the land. Just to give you a quick example, we had a commissioner tell us, and this is a common story, I think Commissioner could probably validate this, that we get forest supervisors and forest rangers that come from New Jersey, New York, somewhere in the West, and they come out and they're stationed for maybe 18 months, 2 years, 3 years. It takes them about a year or two just to get an understanding of the Western forest, to understand the nature of the situation, and then they're transferred out. And then another one comes in and they're transferred out, and they really have no general understanding of the nature of the situation on the land. They have no ties to the community. While the people, when we had the Bryan Head fire, I was down a couple days after the fire. It was one of the largest fires in Utah history a couple years ago. And the people across the board said, we knew this was coming. Why couldn't we simply go up and protect the forest and protect our land? Everyone knew this was coming. In fact, the gentleman who runs the general store at a Blue Ribbon fishery at Panguitch Lake, he went out and bought an 8,000-gallon water tank to be able to spray the area around his store and around the houses, because they knew eventually the fire was coming. Sadly, the tanker truck didn't show up until 3 days after the fire hit. But they're living just in fear of these risks that are tremendous. because they simply don't have the ability to manage their own land on the same terms that all the states east of the Rockies do.
And before we close, Carla, why don't we ask them about the 30 by 30 summit? You are both in Lincoln, Nebraska now. Tell us more about what this summit is and what is this 30 by 30 plan. Will, you were the one who first alerted me to this about 8 or 9 months ago. And Carla and I were talking that a lot of people have no idea what this is. It just sort of went in under the radar.
Mm-hmm. Our lawmakers, who are more attuned to federalism issues than many of them, have not heard about it. And even when I was mentioning to my husband that I was going to be recording this video today, he asked me about, is 30 by 30 new? And I'm like, no, it's about a year old.
Yeah.
And again, I heard about it first from you, Representative Ivory.
And I heard about it from Commissioner Cavan. So, Commissioner, why don't we just give you the floor for a few minutes to explain what this summit's all about and what's this 30-30 summit or the 30-30 plan?
Well, let me just say real quick, and you guys have pretty much alluded to it, because a lot of people don't know. And so you have these environmental entities and others that are out there doing polls, and they're selling what the federal government's doing with this as this grandiose plan to save all the lands and do all this stuff. The fact of the matter is if Margaret Byfield, who is with the American Stewards of Liberty, hadn't jumped on this back in I think it was probably March last year, along with others, and really started holding these entities to their feet to the fire. And the way you know that was effective with what has been going on and what we've been doing was they had to rebrand what first started out as the 30 by 30, and they had to rebrand it to America the Beautiful to try and sell it. And so this for me, and when I talk with people, it's about educating the folks across the West, across the country, to understand what is going on with this process and how ridiculous it is. I mean, really and truly, part of this, there's so many tools in the federal toolbox, and even some of our states. In New Mexico, our governor and our legislature are coming for mineral rights. They're coming for water rights. They're coming for land rights. And so we have to educate folks on what is really going on. For me personally, if we're not careful, our dairies, our ranchers, our farmers are all going to be highly affected by this, and you're going to have microbe burgers and microbe sausage and everything else, because you're going to destroy our ranchers and our cattle, our dairies, everything else, and you're going to put it in a situation. But it all goes to government control, and let our ranchers, let our farmers, let our dairy guys, let us at the county level take care of our business, because I feel like, are the best stewards of the land out here, and not someone from out on the East Coast who's reading from a book or looking at it on a computer and pointing and going, oh, look at this. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that they're coming with that is going to be very detrimental to us out west, and they're not going to do this east of the Mississippi. This is all going to be going on west of the Mississippi, and we got to be aware of it and be educated on it. And I really appreciate Representative Ivory and his work. I spent a lot of time talking with Secretary Bernhardt, and we've got to make people aware and educate people on this.
And Representative Ivory, in your answer, could you help us square that circle? Because I'm looking at that 30%, and I don't get how that is even achievable, given the fact that currently the federal government only owns 27% of the land in the United States.
Yeah, so simply put, the 30 by 30 agenda is to put the most stringent federal restrictions on 30% of all U.S. land and water by the year 2030 as a stepping stone to 50 by 50, to lock up 50% of all land and water by the year 2050. It also includes a complete and total decarbonization of our energy and transportation infrastructure. So when you combine those two and you control 50% of all land, and then a complete transition of our energy infrastructure, land and energy, that's liberty and property. That's the foundation of our system of American government, that the federal government is declaring by executive fiat that they're taking control over these things. That's not the way government works in the United States of America. 3 weeks ago today, President Biden invoked the Defense Production Act. That was the act that you'll recall in World War II, they took the General Motors and Ford and other plants to build tanks. Well, President Biden invoked the Defense Production Act to nationalize U.S. energy, to look at mineral production for wind, solar, and batteries and that sort of thing, to build this intermittent power supply. And so when the national government, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows the federal government to take over, to nationalize energy, and yet that's what's happening. And so it's something that's very critical. When you look at the choice of energy, virtually every other decision in our life is dependent on our access to affordable, reliable energy. And so we now have the federal government shutting off the energy infrastructure that we've had for 100 years that was affordable, reliable, and up until last year, independent, and essentially burning that bridge in order to build a bridge to a new, better society, build a better America, they say. We simply don't have the resources and the materials, the amount of minerals, the amount of resources required to power the United States entirely from wind, solar, battery. Some of the estimates are it's more than 5-6 times the known world reserves of minerals to even do some of these things. So it's really tremendous, but constitutionally, there's no authority for this. Practically, those are decisions that lie within every individual American when you look at how we power our lives. So it's a very big issue. It's something we all need to be aware of. The types of things they're talking about going forward is even criminalizing anyone in the fossil fuel production chain. I've got a video of President Biden saying, yeah, we're going to put these people in jail, the people who produce oil and gas. And so it's a very tremendous transition. It's a very heavy hand of government. We're certainly seeing the economic consequences now. And it's certainly something that Americans need to be alerted to, certainly state representatives, local government officials alerted to. And we need to reclaim that choice, that liberty of how we control our local communities and our lives. That's that balance in our government is the essence of how we protect the constitutional nature of our system.
Well, thank you so much. There's so much to discuss here. Carla and I still have like 2 or 3 pages of notes and things we wanted to get to. I think you'll probably have to get to those next week.
Yeah, with Representative Stratton and Ivory.
Right. I just want to close it out with, this is a quote. I want to share the screen here from Margaret Byfield. She is the woman, like Will, you mentioned her. She's part of the American Stewards of Liberty. She's leading this whole fight against the 30 by 30 plan. And she's there at the summit with you. I love this quote from her. She says, your best land manager is that person who lives his entire life on that land and spends his entire life taking care of it and producing from that land. That person knows every acre better than anybody else and has experienced every cycle of weather on that land. Nobody is going to take care of that land better than that person who is directly tied to the land. You cannot replace that with administrative bureaucracy. And that's Margaret Byfield. I feel like that's exactly what you both have been saying today. So I want to just thank you so much for being a part of this discussion. And I hope we just obviously keep this going, because we can't let this drop.
Right.
All right. Any final words that you would like to say before we close out, Representative or Commissioner?
Yeah, I would just simply say that Europe has gone down this road. They're 5 to 10 years ahead of us, and we're seeing exactly where this goes. They're now having to go back and rebuild coal plants and rebuild oil and natural gas to simply keep the lights on in Europe. They've gone down this road, and it simply hasn't worked. We need to be very circumspect in how we power our future, because energy is the essence of our liberty.
Commissioner?
And I would concur with the representative, and I really appreciate words of wisdom. And we have to have a balanced energy opportunities in this country, and whether it's renewables, oil and gas, clean coal. I mean, you guys saw what happened in Texas just a little over a year ago, and that's the result of what we're doing with these renewables. And then after the polar vortex, then you came into the summer where California and Texas were having to beg their folks to keep their thermostats down, don't plug your cars in, don't do this stuff. We can't sustain with just what those renewables are providing. We've got to get back to a balanced energy source in this country. And it only makes sense. And we could talk about all this stuff for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours because there's so much in there and so much that the federal government has. And once again, I'll even say some of our states. And so I really appreciate you guys. I appreciate you, Representative, and I'll look forward to visiting with you tonight and tomorrow here at the summit.
We appreciate you both too. Thank you.
Thank you both. And we will see you next time on another ALEC TV live stream.
Thank you.